This short video will focus on President Hoover, who was elected in 1928, and the Great Depression and the election of 1932. Just to reiterate the effects of the Great Depression on America. The Depression was more than an economic catastrophe. It changed the American way of life. Belief in the stock market had been cast iron, and many people had to recalibrate their values in the wake of the Wall Street crash. Due to the economic conditions, thousands of companies went out of business, which consequently put even more people out of work. In 1932, there were 12 million people unemployed, which was 1/4 of the entire workforce. 12,000 people were losing their jobs on a daily basis. 20,000 companies went bankrupt. 1,616 banks closed down. 1 out of every 20 farmers was thrown off their land for not making mortgage repayments. In 1932, 23,000 people committed suicide in America. Unemployment was the worst problem. There were no government benefit system in place. Every city saw long bread lines for free handouts of bread and soup. Some people even starved to death in a country that in 1928 had been the richest in the world. The president at the time, Herbert Hoover, believed that the government should let people lead their own lives and sort out their own problems. This policy was called rugged individualism. Consequently, he did little to help the unemployed, especially as he believed that prosperity would return almost immediately. However, Hoover was blamed for the Depression, you might argue somewhat unfairly, and the phrase, "In Hoover we trusted, now we are busted," was coined. Shanty towns were called Hoovervilles, and Hoover stew was the soup given out by charity kitchens. In 1930, Hoover cut taxes by $130 million, and in 1931 he built the Hoover Dam. This created jobs and increased the electricity supply in Nevada and Arizona. And on the picture here you can see the dam that was built and somewhat controversially named the Hoover Dam. In 1932, Hoover went further and implemented the Emergency Relief and Reconstruction Act. This gave $300 million to states for helping the unemployed. However, many Republicans disliked the federal government interfering in state matters, and as a result, only $30 million of the $300 million that was offered was given to the unemployed. The election of 1932 was contested between Herbert Hoover and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Hoover, standing for the Republicans, had a difficult life. He'd been orphaned at 8 years old, but later graduated as a mine engineer and left the USA at the age of 25 to work in the gold mines of Australia. For the next 15 years, he traveled the world as a mine engineer, and by the age of 40, he was a multimillionaire. His main political belief was that the American government should not interfere in people's lives, shown through his policy of rugged individualism. Hoover had been elected in 1928 when the USA was the richest country in the world. One of his election pledges was that there would be 2 cars in every garage and a chicken in every pot. Roosevelt, on the other hand, had come from a rich and pampered background. He read history and law at Harvard and helped run the US Navy during World War I. His life was not free from tragedy, though. In 1921, he caught the disease polio and was paralyzed from the waist down. FDR spent 5 years fighting against paralysis. He later recalled how he'd spent 2 years in bed trying to move my big toe. He eventually used metal crutches and could walk short distances. In 1928, he was elected as the governor of New York State, and he spent his time there striving to make life better for ordinary people. He focused on old age pensions, providing help for farmers, unemployment relief. He used $20 million in tax money to help the unemployed in his state. When he stood for election in 1932, he claimed he would put faith once more in the forgotten man at the bottom of the economic pyramid. As you can see from this map, Roosevelt won by an enormous majority. In fact, it was the biggest majority in 90 years, and this showed not only how unpopular Hoover was, but how effective an election campaigner that FDR was. Although FDR won the election in November of 1932, he was not inaugurated until March 1933. The American Constitution at the time said that a newly elected president must wait 4 months until the 4th of March the following year to take office. The aim of this rule was to give a new president time to prepare for his new job and time for the retiring president to complete his work. Hoover began the lame duck months by announcing tax cuts in December 1932. He cut government spending by $800 million. This included spending on weapons. He also attempted to reorganize the banking system. Roosevelt, FDR, accused Hoover of reckless and extravagant spending, even though ultimately the lame duck months policies failed. In these months, unemployment rose to 15 million. There were wage cuts. In some cities, there was little to no public transport and a lack of electricity and gas across the country as suppliers simply went out of business. By the start of March 1933, every bank in America had closed, and people were talking about the complete collapse of the American economy. On the 4th of March 1933, Roosevelt made his inauguration speech in which he called for action and action now. Most famously, he rallied Americans with the statement that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. FDR immediately asked for Congress to grant him executive powers to wage war against the emergency. This was called the Trading with the Enemy Act. On the 6th of March, he ordered the banks to stay shut so he and his cabinet could work out a plan to save them. He forbade Americans to take gold or silver coins out of the country. Many Americans were pleased that FDR was firm, but some were horrified that he was acting like a dictator. By some, he was accused of leading the country down the road to socialism.